Hi, everyone. And wherever you are, around the world, thank you so much for joining us at Buddhist Door for an evening of insightful conversation with Leslie Rinchen-Wongmo. Leslie, as you probably already know, is a textile artist, teacher, and one of the few non-Tibetans today to have mastered the art of silk applique thangkas. So most of us who are familiar with Vajrayana Buddhism or Buddhist art may be familiar with thangkas, being representations of Buddhist deities and iconography. But thangkas can be produced in a variety of ways, and Leslie's work is unique among these diverse methods. We're very fortunate that she has written a book weaving together the threads of her story. As you might already know, it's titled Threads of Awakening, an American woman's journey into Tibet's sacred textile art. This book will be published very shortly in August by She Writes Press. I actually reviewed the book just this month, and I personally feel that it tells an eloquent journey of how she came to this artistic vocation, replete with emotional richness and raw honesty. So we're here tonight to discuss her upcoming book, as well as her broader calling in art and Buddhist spirituality. So I shall not take up any more time and hand over straight over to Leslie. It's my great pleasure to invite her to begin her talk, and there will be question and answers later. So we do hope you stick around to ask Leslie anything you might have on your mind. So thank you, Leslie.
Thank you, Raymond. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for your very thoughtful review. I really appreciated your deep reading of my book. And thank you everybody for being here. So I recognize some of you. I'm wondering how many people came through a connection with me and how many came from the Buddhist Door communication. See if, I don't think all the pictures on the screen. Who came through Buddhist Door alone and has not ever known of me? Okay, I see Cindy, and I see some other people who don't have video on, so I don't know. And then I see a few people that I'm already connected with, and I'm really happy to have you here. Speaking publicly is not my most comfortable place, but when I have friends that I know I'm talking to, friends that I'm already connected with, and new friends who are here today, that makes me much more present to share. So I am going to share my screen and show you lots of pretty pictures as I speak. And as Raymond said, we're going to have questions at the end, but see, now I'm having to admit people there. If you have a burning question or something that seems really directly relevant to something I'm speaking about and you want to interrupt, just unmute yourself and ask me a question. Don't worry about that. I like to have conversation. So, okay, let's see if this works as it should. Okay, do you see the book cover? All right, very good. All right, so Threads of Awakening. As I was saying, for those of you who were here when I started talking before we got started formally, when I started writing this book, I didn't really know what kind of book it was going to be. And actually, for almost from the beginning of my thangka journey, I knew that I was uniquely positioned to write a book about this art form. As a literate English-speaking person who could convey this to a lot of parts of the world. And there aren't many books about it, but I had no idea what kind of book it would be. And for many, many years, I much preferred doing the art, making the art, than writing about the art. But eventually what it became is, I call it a Buddhist art memoir. And that's really just the words that are best today, because it really doesn't fit neatly into any genre. It's about a trip to India that changed the trajectory of my life and the sacred textile art that I learned from the Tibetans there. Raymond wrote in his review, it's part travelogue, part spiritual biography, and part artistic chronicle. So here we go on our journey, on our artistic chronicle and travel log. Let's see if yes, I do know how to do this. Okay, this is all new to me. So thank you I hope that all the technology is going to work. Did some practice. So in 1992, I packed everything I owned in my parents' garage, bought a one-way ticket to Singapore, and set out to travel around Asia. And who knew where else? I didn't know, but for a year was my plan. I was going to travel for a year. Well, 2 years later, my parents got pretty fed up with my things still filling their garage and made me sell most of it in a garage sale on my next visit home, because I ended up staying out of the country. I did come back for visits, but I ended up living in Dharamsala, India for 9 years. My year of travel, my supposed year of travel, got waylaid in less than 2 months when I rolled into a northern Indian town called Dharamsala and found myself completely at home. Really surprised to feel completely at home as the bus pulled into this town. Dharamsala is in the northern Indian state of Himachal Pradesh, in the foothills of the Himalayas, and it's the home of His Holiness the Dalai Lama in exile. It's the land of the indigenous Gadi people, and it was a summer hill station for the British in colonial times. Now it's a popular tourist destination with a well-known cricket stadium, and with visitors from all over India and all over Tibet, and international students, travelers, and volunteers. So I had arranged to volunteer for the Planning Council of the Tibetan government in exile. And presumably I was going to help them run a revolving loan fund to assist economic development projects in the refugee community. But the fund approval kept getting held up, as these things do. And I soon took on a completely different task. I worked with a retired Indian census official to design the first census of the Tibetan refugee population. So that was what I was doing at the office in the afternoons. In the mornings, I was taking Tibetan language classes and Buddhist philosophy classes. And I was living at the Tibetan library, so in the heart of Tibetan community with some foreign students of Buddhism, some volunteers, and a lot of Tibetan thangka painters. There was a thangka painting school also at the library. One day, as part of my work with the Planning Council, I was asked to join an economic development tour of handicraft centers in the area, the Tibetan handicraft centers. There was an American visiting who had a company. He was starting a company to sell Tibetan made goods in the States and share the profits with the Tibetan community to promote economic development. So I, as a volunteer at the Planning Council, went along as he toured these different handicraft sites. And we visited several sites, most of which I've completely forgotten. But what I do remember most is our visit to the Norbulinka Institute. And it's there that I saw something that changed the direction of my life. So here we walked in that day, and it was still very much under construction, as you can see. This was December 19th, 1992. So it's still under construction, but the art workshops were already operating inside. And there was wood carving and metal sculpting and thangka painting, some other things I'm not sure I remember, and then this. We walked into this kind of sewing workshop where these young Tibetans were sitting on the floor, stitching and ironing and laughing and creating things like this. And I was fascinated. I had done some quilting. Hadn't done it for a while, but I had done some in the past. And I was studying Buddhist philosophy. And somehow these images, what else is, I have to admit people, these figures that were like messengers of the philosophy rendered in fabric just blew me away. And I fell in love with them in a sense. This is one, was just laid out on a blanket on the floor. The teacher had just put this all together, so it's not even framed yet. And so I kind of forgot the purpose of the economic development tour. I was so just drawn into this artwork and the textures. And I lingered as the group started to move on to the other, we were on a tour. And I tried to ask the teacher some information. I wanted to know more. I wanted to understand if I could learn this. And I think he thought I was a little strange. He didn't know what I was asking. And I finally ran and caught up with the rest of the group. Now, I was familiar with thangka paintings. As I said, I lived at the Tibetan library near the thangka painting school and had a lot of thangka painting friends. And most thangkas, and I imagine many of you have seen thangka paintings, they're painted on canvas. So they stretch it like this on this wooden frame. And this is a cotton, usually cotton or linen, occasionally silk, but not normally, treated with, I think, gesso and then painted on with mineral colors. And usually thangkas, sometimes they're historical figures or spiritual teachers, but often they contain images of meditational deities, which are divine figures. They're often inaccurately or misleadingly referred to as gods and goddesses, but they're actually enlightened beings, awakened beings, or Buddhas. And there's many ways to view these figures and many practices in relation to the figures in gradations from external beings to internal representations of the awakening of our own qualities. But in essence, they represent the highest qualities of human potential. They're embodiments of our own true nature in its most awakened and realized sense. And their purpose is to liberate us, to free us from ignorance and suffering. Vajrayana Buddhism, or Tantric Buddhism, which is practiced in Tibet, uses visualization and imagination to kind of adjust our perspective, to realign one's perception and identity with a more open and free view of ourselves and of reality. And so the images on thangkas serve as models for visualization. And they also serve as objects of reverence. In thangka painting, color and pattern are laid on the surface of a canvas. Sorry if it takes me a minute. Every time I admit somebody, I have to click back to my slideshow. So, all right, there. So the art I discovered that day at Norbulinka was a completely different kind of thangka. The images were the same, the figures were the same, but this form of thangka is made from pieces of fabric stitched together. And it's much, much rarer than painting. It's always been rarer than painting, but it had become even rarer in exile. And so rare, in fact, that most of the Tibetans that I spoke with when I got back to the library had never even heard of it. I would later learn that it's an ancient tradition that goes back at least to the 15th century. And it was in Tibet, at least in the 15th century, and then it spread around the region to Mongolia, Bhutan, and Ladakh. And the technique of stitching, which I'm going to get into and describe for you, was often used for very large displays. Like you can see here, this is on the walls of the Potala Palace in Lhasa. But it was also done on a smaller scale, which is what we will explore more, because I don't make anything that big. This is a recent picture just because I was thrilled to see this in the last week being shared around on Facebook. This large applique thangka was recently made and displayed as part of the full ordination ceremony for 140 some nuns in Bhutan last week, which is just a really groundbreaking event for female monastics in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And many people have been working for many, many years to make this ordination possible. So I was thrilled at the event itself, and then additionally thrilled to see that an applique thangka was displayed that day. So I'm not going to talk initially here about my challenges finding a teacher. You can read those stories in my book when it comes out in August, or maybe you'll ask me some questions at the end. But I'm going to skip ahead now to my apprenticeship and how these thangkas are constructed. So this is Dorji Wongdo. He was my second teacher and the main teacher. I served apprenticeship with him for about 4 years. And he was a monk when I started and when this picture was taken, but he became a layperson during the course of my apprenticeship. And here he's transferring a piece of a thangka drawing to silk satin. So this rolled up white fabric here has the drawing, the master drawing that's going to be the template for this thangka. And here he has transferred a small portion of this drawing onto green satin. And what he's doing now, I believe, I'm not 100% sure, but I believe the way he's transferred the lines here was the oldest technique we used, which was to make little pinholes along every line of the drawing on the tracing paper, and then put a section of the drawing over fabric and dust it with chalk powder. And so the chalk powder would go through the little holes and transfer that piece of the drawing to the fabric. And what he's doing here is going over those chalk lines with a pen so that they stay in place while we then start to work with the fabric and stitch on it. So these are, I love this picture. It's blurry. It was taken by a friend of mine, British photographer, Diane Barker. And she always apologizes for its blurriness, but I just love the movement and the energy and the laughter. And it captures the spirit of the workshop where I did my 4 years of apprenticeship. The workshop is called a tsemkang. It's a sewing workshop. And it's just to give you a sense of how Tibetan words are constructed. They're little pieces of meaning stuck together. So tsemkang is made up of tsem, which means to sew, and kang, which is a house. So it's a sewing house. So here, these girls are making a brocade frame for painted thangka. All right, and this is the table we sat around and did most of our hand stitching. So now I'm going to read to you a little piece from the book about how it was in the tsemkang. I squeezed into my place at the low table that filled one end of the large workshop. Just 15 inches off the floor, its surface was covered by a threadbare white tablecloth. Wool mats wrapped in blue cotton softened the floor on 3 sides. These meager cushions would make long hours of sitting on concrete tolerable. The space between walls and table was just wide enough for me to walk around on the mats and take my seat. Sunlight streamed in from windows that dominated 2 of the walls from waist height to ceiling. The third wall was inset with shallow shelves. A boombox sat on one shelf, beneath a photo of the Dalai Lama. Another shelf was strewn with 10 or 12 cassette tapes in their boxes. A dozen apprentices sat cross-legged, sock-footed or barefoot, around that vast table, each tending to a small piece of silk satin or brocade, individual contributions to a collaborative Buddha image. At 32, I was the oldest apprentice and the only inji. Inji is a Tibetan slang for a person of European descent. My American-bred, chair-spoiled legs could not remain crossed for long before numbness and tingling set in. To keep the blood flowing, I extended my legs and leaned back against the cool concrete wall as I stitched. As a rule, Tibetans refuse to step over books and bodies because pointing one's feet toward either is considered disrespectful. Words and people are respected as teachers. So when one of my fellow apprentices had to get up from the table, whether to retrieve materials, use the sewing machine, show Dorji Wongdo her progress, or visit the loo, her cross-legged Tibetan colleagues effortlessly cleared a path for her. They would lean forward just slightly over their neatly crossed legs, allowing her to pass behind them. But what to do with the sprawling foreigner whose legs spanned the path between wall and table? Sometimes I managed to quickly recross my legs and scoot forward to make space at my back. Other times I pulled my knees up and squished myself into the wall to make space for her to pass in front. I would think the path was clear. But then, in a stunning act of propriety that made me cringe from my coarse Americanness, my colleague would reach down to lift a corner of my shawl where it was piled on the floor next to me and gently move it out of her way to avoid disrespecting even my clothing with her foot. If they're this demonstrative in their respect for ordinary people, imagine the respect they show to thangkas, whose images are believed to be manifestations of enlightenment, alive with the energy of the Buddhas they represent. Every piece of a Buddha to be deserved the highest esteem. Reverence permeated Dorji Wangdu's workshop, harmonizing with gossip and pop music. So here's the group of apprentices in my first year. There were some more, it got a little bigger as the years progressed, but this was the group. So you can see me in the back here. And there's Dorje Wangdu and the other apprentices I worked with. This was one of the apprentices' daughters. And then of course, the dogs. Can't have a good functioning workshop without pets. All right, so now we'll start to look at how this work is put together. I like this picture because you can really see the texture here. So you can see how all the lines, all the outlines and contours are created by this cord that is raised up from the fabric. And the stitches go over the cord, so they're barely visible. They're more visible actually on this because stitches tend to be more visible on light color cords. I think it's just the way the light reflects, but so you can see a few stitches. But for the most part, the stitches disappear into these cords, and I will show you how that happens. But first I'll show you, so see how here, the illusion of a turning scarf is created actually by pieces of different colored fabric. So it looks like this is the lining and this is the front of the fabric and then the lining as it twists, but it's actually built by separate pieces. So we start with a drawing, and a thangka painter also starts with a drawing, and the drawings are made according to traditional proportional guidelines that are written in the early scriptures, the early days of rendering images of enlightened beings. But here, so in a thangka painting, the drawing becomes the thangka. The drawing is the base on which all the colors are applied, and it becomes the artwork itself. Here instead, it acts as a template and a map, but it never becomes part of the finished work. So the lines are made with those cords I told you about. They're made with horsehair wrapped with silk thread. And so in the upper picture, you see silk filaments before it's spun into thread, the fibers. And then below you see horse hair from the tail of a horse. And strangely enough, when you wrap silk thread around a horsehair, you would think it might just fall off. But if you've ever looked at a hair under a microscope, you'll see that it has scales, it has crevices, and the silk fiber is very fine and it kind of catches in those crevices. So if you wrap it just so, Raymond cited this excerpt actually from page 127 of the book. When you wrap that fibrous silk thread around a scaly hair from the tail of a horse, the thread's fibers get caught in the hair's scales. They cling, and the sheer strength of that clinging binds them. The thread remains securely wrapped around the hair. No adhesives required. Now, I have to admit, it took me weeks of practice to learn to wrap thread around hair. It was a mess the first time I did it, and the second time, and every now and then still. But you know, like anything with practice, it comes together. So this is showing how I actually wrap thread around 3 strands of horsehair. And when I finish, and if you like, and if my little setup and the technology works, I can actually show you live my wrapping it and how it works. We'll see when we get there. Sometimes I use a treadle sewing machine to help with the turning of the horsehair, because it can be very fatiguing on the muscles of the hand. Yeah. All right. So now, this is my cat, Siri, by the way. She likes Zoom calls. So what we see here is, on the top here is the silk wrapped horsehair cord. And here is a sewing thread made from the same thread that was wrapped around the hair. I've attached them at the end here, and there's a large eyed needle on the cord, on the horsehair cord, and a very fine needle on the sewing thread. Now you can see on the fabric these lines. So this is how this has been transferred, as I said. So this is the belt, actually, of a figure, I think, of Green Tara. This is the belt. And so here you can see where I've actually laid the cord down on the fabric and used the thread to stitch it. It's called a couching stitch, and so you make loops, and those kind of anchor the cord along the lines. So here you can see it in action. And this was even one of the interesting things I noticed, and it felt completely natural to me, but in working with students over the years, I've realized that it's often not natural to people who have learned to hand sew in the West. Most of my students at first want to stitch horizontally across the fabric, the plane that they're working on. And yet we tend, in the thangka making, or how I learned it from the Tibetans, you stitch more vertically downward and towards you. And that allows the cord to just hang down with gravity. And as I turn, because you can see you're having to make lines in all different directions and along these natural flowing forms. And so the stitching downward allows the cord to just fall along the line where it needs to, with the help of gravity. So this is what we come up with when we put these cords on the fabric. Then we cut out each piece, and we have this bunch of puzzle pieces, in a sense. And you see how there's like an edge on each one. So then the edge gets turned under before I put all the pieces of the puzzle together. See, here's turning the edges under. So I'm using a screwdriver, but it's any tool to just kind of fold the edges under and use a little bit of adhesive, and then iron them down. And then the pieces, here you can see it really clearly. Here you can see where the cord's been put down, then it was cut out, and then turned under. Here where the thumb is, it's already been turned under. Here it still needs to be turned under. And then the pieces are put together. And they're put together, one overlapping the one next to it. So there's no ground. And in that sense, the term applique, which is the most commonly used term for this art form, is not really accurate, because applique usually refers to applying something to the surface. So you usually apply a piece or pieces to a background fabric. In this art form, there is no ground. The pieces are held together by their interconnections. And I find that inspiring and metaphorical, because we're also held together by our interconnections. And if we look really deeply into reality, we keep finding nothing there, in a sense, nothing that's existing all on its own. It's existing in relation to everything else. So the drawing at the beginning, it's a template for transferring to separate pieces of fabric. And then at the end, it's a map for putting all those separate pieces together so that they end up looking like the form that we're aiming for. So you build the design cluster by cluster, piece by piece, and then cluster by cluster until it gets larger and larger. Here you can see a couple of my colleagues working at the table, and she's stitching together. This is almost the end because all the pieces are already together. So she's doing some last bit of stitching together. And the way the stitching together happens is it's using that same looping stitch over the cord, but this time it's going through the piece that it's overlapping. So it's holding more and more pieces together. So you can see the texture here. That's what distinguishes this from thangka paintings. Paintings tend to be more, or can be, let's say, can be more finely detailed than applique works, because the painters can work with the finest of brushes. Sometimes they make brushes with only a few sable hair, a few hairs. This form tends to be more, I can't think of the right adjective, but somewhat bigger spaces, less teeny tiny details, because the cord itself and the fabric itself takes up space. Like it has its own limit of how small you can go. But what it does have is it's this vibrancy and this texture and this aliveness that comes out at you. Here you can see the texture from the side. And what I like about this picture, I wouldn't like it in the real world to see, but I like it for showing you, is in the front. You can see here, because it's backlit and the light is shining through the fabric, so you can actually see the areas where oh, actually this isn't the overlap, it's actually the turned under edge. Interesting. Yeah. All right. Now on painted time, we've just gone back to painting. This is a painting, and this is actually a painting by my friend Migmar, who was a very important person in my time at the library, dear friend, of fabulous thangka painter, and he introduced me to my first applique teacher, and he painted this thangka for me of 1,000-armed Chenrezig, Avalokiteshvara. But what you can see here is you can see the eyes here. And in thangka painting, there's almost a ceremonial aspect to putting the eyes on. They're always put on last, and they call it the opening of the eyes. Now with applique thangkas, though, you can't do that, because the eyes have to be put on the face before the face gets put on the body and the headdress and the crown and the background and everything. So very different approach, but it's still considered the highest skill. It's the last thing taught to apprentices. And I hadn't yet learned how to embroider the eyes when I was eager to start putting thangkas together on my own, because at the Tsemkang, the Genla Dorji Wangdu managed the whole process, right? So he held the drawing, and he transferred the section of the drawing to the fabric that he chose, and then assigned one of the students, one of the apprentices, to work on it, and told us what color our line should be, how thick our line should be. And then we would work on it and bring it back to him, and he would then assemble the pieces, and then he would assemble them in clusters, and again assign a cluster to an apprentice to stitch together. So if I was going to be able to make my own thangkas, if I was going to learn that first part of transferring the drawing to the pieces and the last part of putting it all together, I was going to have to start doing it on my own. I could watch him, but I wasn't able to do that in the workshop. But I didn't know how to do eyes. So how was I going to do a thangka on my own? Well, I asked my friend, Alex. So Alex was a thangka painter from Russia or Lithuania. It's a little vague. And he was living at the library studying with the Tibetan thangka master, fluent in Tibetan himself. He went on actually to teach Tibetan art at the in Sarnath at the Tibetan Institute. I forget what it's called, the higher education Tibetan Institute there. So he's a really fine scholar and practitioner of thangka painting. So I asked him to draw me a thangka with no eyes. And he did. He drew me this, which is very much like a traditional thangka composition, with some of the simplified, but some of the landscape elements. And in the center, instead of a deity, he drew me this kind of rock, snow rock vase, and with a waterfall coming out of it, and a blooming lotus flower in the place of the deity's face and limbs. So I was thrilled. So I this is the first piece I made all on my own. It was with cotton bought from the local bazaar and sewing machine thread, you know, regular cotton or polyester thread. The lines are very wiggly and wobbly because it just wasn't quite like working with the fine materials, but it allowed me to master the whole process from beginning to end. But then a little later in the Simkhang, we started to learn eyes. And it's a very particular embroidery technique that's used for the eyes, and it takes a lot of practice. So I spent a year making eyes and faces. These are some of the many, many faces, and these were probably heads on a garland of heads around a wrathful deity's neck. I believe that's what these faces were. These were some other faces. And this is again an excerpt that Raymond cited in his review, short one. Bird's eyes, snake eyes, deer eyes, eyes of snow lions and dragons, garlands of severed heads hanging from wrathful shoulders, humans and animals crushed under wrathful feet. So many faces, so many eyes, all helping someone to see more deeply into reality, to examine more closely the nature of their experience. Faces so small, they sit comfortably in the palm of my hand. Day after day, eyes, eyes, and more eyes. I feel so fortunate to have been in that workshop. You know, because when I make a thangka, it takes me 6 months or a year or 4 months, whatever, and there are 2 eyes, or maybe if it's white Tara, there's 7 eyes, but you don't get a lot of practice. But in that workshop, because we were several people working together on large thangkas with multiple figures, there were so many eyes. And so I feel really grateful. I don't know how I would have mastered it without that. I shouldn't say that because my students managed to master it as well, but they have to keep practicing. You have to find a way to practice. This is a 1,000-arm Chenrezi that we worked on. And a 1,000-arm Chenrezi, or Avalokiteshvara, the Buddha of compassion, was very great practice for stitching hands and eyes because there are 1,000 hands, each with an eye in the palm. And for this project, even the students, the apprentices who were not ready, who were less experienced and maybe wouldn't have normally been ready to learn eyes, they were enlisted in the effort as well for the purpose of making this thangka. So we each worked on, you can see this is like a panel of 100 hands or 50 hands or something. Yeah. So the pieces come together bit by bit, cluster by cluster, until the deity emerges. Just like we come together, experience by experience, condition by condition. I'm going to read another piece here. This is from piece 33. And yeah, actually I call my chapters in the book pieces. So to kind of harken back to this way of putting things together. Piece 33, back to the drawing. After I'd stitched cording along the outlines and contours of my assigned clouds, I rose once again from the low table, navigated the padded obstacle course without pointing a foot at anyone, and reported to Genla with my completed work. I expected him to reject it. There were so many errors and imperfections. If I'd been my teacher, I would have sent me back to fix them all. But Genla rarely did. He simply took each completed piece from my hand, studied it briefly, and nodded. Then he gave me my next assignment. Something in me was disappointed by this. I wanted his standards to be higher than mine. But perhaps my work was actually better than I thought it was. This wouldn't have been the first time I focused on minor defects while others perceived a larger frame. Friends tell me they see my whole smiling face when I fear they're staring at the bald patches in my eyebrows. And they appreciate the grace of my hands while I obsess over a torn cuticle. Though part of me was disappointed by not being called to greater meticulousness, I am grateful for Genla's acceptance. Years of compulsive skin picking and hair pulling have shown me that adjusting, repairing, and other forms of fixing toward perfection can actually take me further and further away from it. Genla taught me to move through perfectionism rather than being blocked or waylaid by it. Now, years later, this is one of the most important lessons I pass on to my students. Only by moving forward imperfectly can we learn and improve. I'm referring to Genla. I don't know if because in the book, it's clear the transition. It might not have been clear in my talk. Dorje Wangdu is my teacher's name, and Genla is the honorific way of referring to a teacher. So it's the same person. Okay. This is a medicine Buddha. And you can see again, I like these pictures that show sort of the way the drawing is being used as a template for putting the pieces together. But this medicine Buddha actually took several years to complete. And I changed the background completely in the process. I started him when my mother was in treatment for cancer of unknown primary site some years ago. And when she recovered, thankfully, hi Mom, I know you're there, thank you. I'm glad you recovered. When she recovered, and I also became indecisive about the background. I was thinking I wanted to change it, but I didn't know how. I just put the piece aside for several years. And then I finally finished it in the first 6 months of the pandemic. Kind of felt like time to call back in the medicine Buddha. We needed healing. And our interconnection as a world was so tangible at that time. It's kind of hard to believe now how, I don't know if harmonious is the right word, but felt a sense of a common struggle that we were having for that period. And I was struck by the feeling at the time that we were all everywhere going through something together in a way that we never had before as a world. And so the phrase, "we're all in this together," kept coming to me. And I reached out to friends all over the world who all were staying at home in their own homes as well, and asked for translations of how they would say, "we're all in this together" in their languages. And I created a quilted border filled with 28 interpretations of "we're all in this together," and placed this Buddha. Oh, but first I'm going to show you the finished piece, but first I'm going to show you the back. I'm going to reveal the back. So normally you don't see this once it's framed and, once it's put in brocade, we cover up the back. But I want you to see it so you can see how it's constructed. So you see the pieces all coming together and the stitches. Yeah. So this is the completed piece. All in this, I call it "all in this together." It's a thangka quilt because the border is quilted. This is going to be exhibited in the Sacred Threads quilt exhibition in Herndon, Virginia, near Washington, D.C. in mid-July. So if anybody is in that area, I recommend going. I was hoping to go in person, but I'm not going to be there. But the work will be there, and then it will travel around the United States for 2 years. So at some point I'll share if you're on my mailing list or you get on my mailing list, I'll share the schedule with you, the travel schedule, and if it comes anywhere near you, you can go see it. But one of the things here, you can see how the words are all in there from many people who sent me phrases from all over the world. I think I don't tend to get lonely anyway. I do well in solitude. I like being alone. But I also think, aside from my cats who are great company, I think when I was working on this, I really felt the companionship of so many people, because I didn't feel, even though I was in my studio all by myself putting these pieces together, I really felt like, 28 languages, but there were more, let's say 40 people or something who contributed. We're all there working with me. So it was I was never alone. At the back of the thangka, when it's finished, on a thangka painting, they draw them on the back of the canvas, the syllables of enlightened body, speech, and mind, Om, Ah, Hum. And so I actually I draw them on little pieces of fabric and glue them on the back. So that's what's happening here. This is one of the large thangkas that I worked on. I actually made the Nagarjuna figure here, down here. This was the first main figure's face that I did in a finished thangka. So not just the little faces around, but yeah. And when I completed my apprenticeship, I was very fortunate to receive His Holiness the Dalai Lama's audience and blessing. I'm not going to tell the whole story of the meeting here. It plays a very prominent role in the book, but I wanted his guidance and his approval before I went out in the world with my art, before I accepted commissions and shared my work. And fortunately, just by an accident of timing, my father was able to accompany me to that audience. So this is just a beautiful memory for all of us. And right now, my dad is recovering from COVID. So please send him good wishes. You can see we're obviously both younger here. This was 1997. So His Holiness told me, among other things, to approach my work with an attitude of excellence, sincerity, respect, and an altruistic intention. So as I work, and I try to live by that as I work. It's one of the reasons I actually like working on commission. Some artists have said they don't like working on commission, or people have asked me if it's a problem, but I actually really like it because I can keep in mind the person who will be living with the thangka and, invest my good wishes in it as I stitch. That makes my work really rewarding. This is Manjushri. Fabrics have a story too. I love this background fabric. This was, I think they said it was about 100 years old or something. I bought this in a shop in London, but it came from Asia. I don't know exactly from where, and it was pure silk and beautiful. So I used it as the backdrop for this Manjushri. And Manjushri is the Buddha or Bodhisattva of wisdom. And all the deities possess the enlightened quality, all the enlightened qualities. So none of them are lacking. It's not like, well, Avalokiteshvara is compassionate, but not very smart, and Manjushri is really wise, but maybe not so nice. It's not like that. They're all the fully awakened, enlightened beings. They just have specialties based on vows that they made in their practice as they became enlightened, or based on the dispositions, the different dispositions of different practitioners and what the people need. And so they appear in different ways, but it's not like they're only wise and only compassionate. This is actually something that from a book by His Holiness and Thupten Chodron called Buddhism, One Teacher, Many Traditions. I like this line. It says, due to sentient beings' different mental inclinations and different physical constituents, various meditation deities appear, but all tantric deities are one nature, the exalted wisdom of bliss and emptiness. This is White Tara. This is a piece I made for my parents, actually. And I'll read the White Tara piece. White Tara, like her sister Green Tara, arose from the compassionate tears of Avalokiteshvara and vowed to become enlightened in female form. She too is the embodiment of enlightened activity and the mother of all Buddhas. Eyes in the palms of her hands and the soles of her feet and the center of her forehead allow her to look everywhere upon all beings with clear-sighted wisdom and deep compassion. Seeing so much with such keen discernment, she knows just how to help each person in their unique predicament. White Tara is specifically associated with longevity practices. Human life is precious, and Tara wants you to enjoy its privileges for as long as possible. Why? To collect more toys and experiences? Or out of fear of what follows? No, of course not. From Tara's perspective, this precious life is a training ground for freedom. Are you taking advantage of the facilities? Tara wants to extend your membership in the human gym for as long as it takes for you to wake up. She'll even send you a personal Dharma trainer. I stitched this White Tara thangka for my parents after making them wait longer than I should have. They asked to commission a thangka from me as soon as I'd finished my first commission. While I appreciated their interest, I felt a need to prove myself in the world before accepting their order. Taking a commission from them felt like cheating. Like maybe they were just asking because they loved me, not because I was really producing something of value. Later, as other friends and relatives also requested commissions, I came to realize that love may be the best conduit for sharing one's gifts. It's what connects us with one another. Rather than resisting the gifts of love, I'm learning to step into the opportunities that love opens. That's how White Tara trained me, while blessing my parents with the longevity we continue to enjoy. And this is Chenrezig, or Avalokiteshvara. I always use both of his names. Avalokiteshvara is the Sanskrit term, and Chenrezig is his Tibetan name. And he's the embodiment of fully awakened compassion. And he's also the patron saint, one might say, of Tibet. And His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, is believed to be an incarnation of Chenrezig. And some of my more recent work, like you saw in the All in This Together Medicine Buddha, puts a traditional Tibetan applique figure in a quilted background. So this is another example. In fact, it's on the wall behind me. Hey, there it is. So I feel a special connection with Chenrezig, and one of my most precious teachers, Kamcho Rinpoche, told me this when I was confused about what to practice. He said, all Dharma is included in Chenrezig. Nothing else is necessary. Chenrezig's wise, compassionate, light-filled form includes all the deities, all the teachings, and all the Buddhas. His 6-syllable mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum, contains all mantras. Bodhicitta, the altruistic intention to become enlightened for the sake of all beings, encompasses all virtuous motivations. It's enough. It's everything. All right, so it looks like I've reached the end. I would love to invite those of you, I know several of you are already on my mailing list. If you're not on my mailing list, I would like to invite you to join. You'll receive Monday morning wake-ups, which are a picture, often a very close detailed picture from one of my applique thangkas, and a quote from a Buddhist or Buddhist adjacent wisdom quote. And you'll also get news and previews of the book if you're on the mailing list in the next couple of months. You can pre-order the book now at your favorite bookseller. If you do so, I don't have any like buy buttons on the site yet. Right now, I'm just inviting you to join my mailing list. But if you go to your favorite bookseller, you can pre-order it. If you do order it now, save your receipt, because starting in a few weeks, in the middle of July, I'm going to announce some special gifts for people who pre-order. So save that and let me know. And I want to, and please also tell other people about the book, because I think we started this conversation at the beginning, Raymond. I would just like people to read it. I think that it has something to offer, both in being the only book about this art form, and also in my peculiar story of how I ended up there. I think there might be something for everybody in the possibilities that they might find in their own lives and their own journeys. So I'm just going to finish by reading. I'm going to finish by reading from the introduction. So we're going to close by going back to the beginning, and then I would love to hear any questions and just chat. This is a book about wonder. I didn't know that when I started writing it. I thought it would be about art, Tibetan art, sacred art, textile art, and my experience learning how to make that art in India. And it is about all those things, but it's also a vehicle for a deeper and more universal story about wonder, finding it, seeing it, making it. It's about charting a course in life with wonder as your guide, your wonder, which is unlike anyone else's. It's about delight in the simplest, most ordinary details and encounters, with a spider, a flower, a human being, or a strand of thread. To wonder, you have to loosen your grip on what you think you know. Quote, it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. End quote. Mark Twain supposedly said that. And Buddhist teachings agree. Things are not as they seem. There are many ways to look at the same thing, and in our looking, we create the thing, even if that thing is ourself, even if it's the world. Travel can help us look differently, and so can Buddhism. The ideas that animate Tibetan Buddhist art are all about examining what we see, interrogating it, wondering about it, seeing it differently, and creating a fresh experience. In this book, you'll read about how I found my way halfway around the globe in the 1990s and settled in the Himalayan hill town of Dharamsala, to study Buddhism and volunteer for the Tibetans in exile. There I learned an ancient textile art, a pieced silk version of the Tibetan wall hanging icons called thangkas. Being in a strange land, among people who spoke an unfamiliar language and saw the world in an unfamiliar way, highlighted the arbitrariness of my own viewpoint and made it easier to try on new perspectives. Facing uncertainty and confusion every day was both disorienting and rich with possibilities. Such physical wandering can open the door to deep spiritual wondering. But exotic travel is not the only way to make those journeys. There are many ways to challenge the familiar, and there's a long spiritual tradition of doing so. You can do it in your own backyard and even inside your own home. Tibetans, in fact, refer to themselves as nangba, or insiders, because they know the path of spiritual transformation is an inside job. The most important work happens in our inner world. We just have to leave the comfort of what we think we already know. All right, I am going to stop sharing my screen. There we are. All right. I would love it if any of you who don't have your video camera on feel comfortable turning your camera on so that we can see each other. So I feel like I'm conversing. It's great to see the faces I see. And if any of the rest of you are comfortable, I'd love to be in conversation with you as well. So.
Well, first, I'd like to thank Leslie very much for her very vivid and inspiring talk on her journey. I'd just like to note that the talk, tonight's event, will be recorded and it will be shared on Buddhist Door's YouTube channel, and so you can always come back to it to get inspired and to rewatch it, should you please. Perhaps we could start the Q&A, and as Leslie has noted, please, if you'd like to ask a question, if only if you want to though, do feel free to turn on your camera so we can see you and we can have a bit of a question and answer back and forth. Perhaps I could start first, kick things off a little.
Sure.
Mine's a very general question, Leslie. Basically, what is the role that inspiration plays when you set off on beginning an artwork, whether it's with commission, whether it's something that someone has asked you to do, or whether it's something that a long-term project that you're setting out on? How do you get in? How does inspiration combine with the very meticulous kind of thangka, the dimensions and the colors? You know what I mean? How do they interact? What's the interplay?
Interesting. Yeah. It changes. I mean, depends very much on the individual project, because certainly as I mentioned, when I have a commission, very much my mind is about what is going to make that person, what is going to be inspiring for that person. So I'm very connected with them. And other times I just feel a wave of something I want to create. So that's in the beginning stage. The thing you said toward the end of your question, we said, how does it interplay with the kind of very technical work? It brings to mind something, because sometimes people think that since thangkas are drawn in a very in a certain prescribed proportional grid, that they're all just copies of one another. But they're not. It's like creativity flows within limits. I think a lot of people have had this experience maybe in writing exercises and other kinds of artistic exercises, where instead of just being thrown out in the open, you're given some limits in which to create. And sometimes that can it can add force in some way to creativity. I
think that's true.
Yeah. And inspiration is an interesting thing also in writing. Not that I consider myself a writer, except for having written this book, but I think, or like any practice, inspiration is important. And then sometimes you're just doing the work, sometimes you're just sitting down and doing the practice. And
sometimes you just do it, right? Yeah. You
just do it because it's what you do and it's what you need to get to the next step. And then inspiration comes again, then it arrives again, but you kind of don't wait for it.
So yeah, I mean that's fantastic. I mean, please, the floor is open for questions of any.
Cindy?
I was wondering if through the 9 years you lived there, how did you continue studying at the library, and what was your life like? I know you had a lot of free evenings probably, and I don't know Dharamsala, but I know a lot of people who have talked to me about it. And I wondered, I know it has horrible monsoons and stuff like that. So in addition to the library, were you able to do other things like teachers, or did you continue that aspect or do all day with the applique?
Yeah, no, I thank you for that question. It's a big one. So I will do my best to answer parts of it. And um, I lived at the library, I believe, for 4 years. At one point, I moved away from the library and then I moved back for another year. So I'm not sure the exact, and I continued the classes. Yeah, about that much time. I continued going daily, 6 days a week, to the Buddhist philosophy classes in the morning. Then, things just like in anywhere we live, things grow and you connect more to other teachers. I had other teachers later who were not at the library. I lived up closer. If you're familiar a little with Dharamsala, you said you've heard about it, but the library is kind of halfway between the lower, mostly Indian town, and the upper, mostly Tibetan settled area. And so the library is like halfway between. So I lived many years at the library, but then I also lived some of the time up closer to the Dalai Lama's temple, and then some of the time further down in the village. And so I had a variety of places that I lived. You mentioned the horrible monsoons. I loved monsoon. I love rain, and I was really in my element. I mean, it was challenging. It has its challenges, but I actually really, really enjoyed it. And I had a lot of friends. So there were different times where I was studying Tibetan language in different ways, either in classes at the library or with private teachers. Then once I started the apprenticeship, I mostly continued to learn by being in the environment, learn by speaking. Every year, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, well, at least once a year, I should say, after Tibetan New Year, after Losar, His Holiness would give teachings. And so all the community would come together for the teachings for, I don't remember, at least a week. And I participated in that. Then he often gave teachings at that time, other times during the year. So we would gather, both the Tibetans and the foreign visitors or volunteers who lived there. I had a rich world of friends, and I guess there were quiet evenings because I didn't tend to go out in the evenings because I don't like to wander alone on dark paths, but at the library we could more because it was lit. But yeah, you had good friends I hung out with, and just a wonderful community. And so a combination of friendship, of nature and mountains, of spiritual teachings, and of going to work and learning this art form. And so after I finished my apprenticeship, so I was there 9 years, the apprenticeship was about 4. So I continued to live there and I did my work. Yeah. I'm sure there's much more I could say about what life was like. So if anyone else has a specific question they want to dig into, I welcome it. But thank you.
Thank you. So I wondered about the studying, whether you, and that obviously from your talk, you have a wonderful way of weaving the Buddhist teachings in there. So I appreciate that. And I really loved your talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, thank you so much. Anyone else have a question they'd like to pose, or a comment, or a sharing?
Yes. Anyone if you prefer to ask Leslie a question without turning on your video, please feel free to do so. There's no obligation whatsoever.
Oh,
yeah.
I see someone also. I let's go ahead with this, but I also see that someone said, yes, please show the wrapping live. That was written a while ago in chat, so I can do that. I can try to do that. Let's say I can try to do that. Does anyone else have a question before I try to do that? All right, let's see if I can do that. I have this camera. Let's see. So I have to switch to, let's see, hold on. All right, you see my hands now? Oh my gosh, let's see if I can do it. All right, this is the first, everybody. All right, so I started this yesterday. So what I have here, let me see there. What I have here is a partially wrapped cord. So this is like a fuchsia colored thread. And you can see here the strands of horsehair. I hope you can see it. Don't know. And so I'm going to hold this thread between my thumb and forefinger, kind of pressing into the flesh of my finger. And then with my right hand, I'm going to turn and get this thread out of the way. And I'm going to turn, and I hope it doesn't get all tangled and I don't have to be embarrassed, but we'll see. So with the right hand, see, I'm turning, I'm making it rotate. And as I do, the thread is wrapping around. See how this part that's wrapped is getting longer and longer? If anyone wants to ask me something verbally while I do this, you can do that. And you can see why I use the treadle sewing machine. The bobbin winder on the treadle sewing machine spins this, you know, I can kind of anchor it in there and it spins. So I'm still doing the guiding it by hand, but it saves the turning hand from the fatigue that comes from doing this. And we usually use 3 strands of horsehair, but for very, very fine things, sometimes fingertips and certainly the lines around eyes and mouths, I use just 1 strand of hair in the core. And the reason for the hair, you might wonder, why don't we just use thread, right? Thread is just floppy. It has no, you couldn't make a smooth line. Sorry, I have to learn how to keep my hands in the frame on this thing. So the hair it's flexible, but it's got more, not quite rigidity, but body, some stability than just a floppy thread. So it makes the perfect material for wrapping. Now, in Dorji Wangdu's workshop, instead of horsehair, we used nylon fishing line in the center. But with nylon fishing line, you have to use a glue because it doesn't have those crevices and scales to hold on to the silk fibers. I'm almost at the end. You see here, I have like a bit of putty, a little putty on the end, just to keep the ends of the hair from flying around and getting tangled. So when I get to that end, and we would normally do 2 layers. So I'm only showing you 1 here, but I would go over it again. So now I'm going to take off this little putty and go right to the end of the hairs. And then I'm gonna, there it is. So then I have cord. And like I said, I would probably go and put another layer of thread over it so it has a little more thickness, but this can make the lines of any drawing. And then what I have that I broke off at the end, I have a little more thread left over, and I would retwist this thread into sewing thread that I use then to attach these cords onto the fabric. So I'm going to put my face back on the screen if I can. Let's see. Oh. There I am. Hey, it worked.
That was really very meticulous. We could see how the, what do they call it, the motor skills required to really. Anyone have any other points of discussion or questions for Leslie?
I have a question.
Okay, Gail.
So have you always had agility with your hands? Have you, like, from the time you were a kid, did things with
Interesting
your hands?
question. Interesting question. Huh. I did some quilting, but not as a kid. That was in college and such. And I dabbled in different arts, but they weren't particularly. No, I can't. I did some painting, but I don't know if that's specifically agility with hands. You know, I wasn't doing knitting or anything. No, I do comment, and you heard in one of the readings, you know, from the time I could reach my hands to my mouth, I bit my nails and I picked at everything. So I had a way of using my hands that maybe isn't what we would think of in the positive sense of dexterity, but I was definitely being very detail oriented and meticulous about every quote flaw, every unevenness or irregularity in my fingers and picking them off. So I sometimes say, and I had written a chapter or a piece for the book that I ultimately deleted that was specifically about this behavior and how it lines up with this work with thangkas. But it's not that by stitching thangkas I stopped doing those other things, but in some way the fact that I had that energy in my hands and that sense of finding the irregularities and fixing them, I think in some way made me naturally suited for this work. And also it's a positive channel for the work. It's not like it makes me not do the less positive stuff, but it makes me feel in some way that there's these behaviors that I've struggled with and not welcomed have brought me some gift, you know. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gail Michelle.
Any further questions for reflection, for discussion?
I could ask a few questions if nobody else wants to ask.
Go ahead, Trish.
I'm just, excuse me for, I'm a bit nervous asking questions live, I'm afraid. Trying to stretch my boundaries. So
it's okay. I'm nervous answering them too. So we're in this together.
And so I've been a weaver for a number of years, a couple of decades, and I've always wondered if there was anything done in fabric, you know, like the tapestries. I don't know if you are familiar with tapestry weaving, but I had been curious as to whether there were tapestries available. And so this has been fascinating for me, just fascinating to see. As you said, it's not really applique, but these applique thangkas, it's just, I never expected it, really, and kind of fell upon the invitation for tonight. So I was wondering, I think you mentioned this, but what was the oldest thangkas, these applique thangkas? When would the oldest ones have been made?
Yeah. I think the oldest
kind of falls into my other questions.
Okay. I think the oldest documented applique thangka was a giant thangka made and displayed in, I think it's 1468 in Tibet, at Samye Monastery, I believe. And that's the oldest documented one, but there may have been smaller scale works earlier than that. And the advantage that the fabric thangkas offered is that they could be made gigantic and displayed so that thousands of people could see the image at the same time. And because a painting wouldn't be able to withstand that, it would crack and such. So that was the breakthrough, I think.
Okay, and I don't recall when synthetic dyes came along, but I think it was 17 or 1800, something like that. So would they have used natural dyes? And if so, what kinds of natural dyes would be used for such vibrant colors? Because I don't recall, I was a natural dyer for a while. I've never found any information about them using indigo dyes. Well, it's kind of cool in Tibet for indigo. So they'd kind of have to use something to blues.
Well, actually, so your sound is going in and out, but I think I heard most of your question.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. It's all right. I think I heard it. Now, the thing is that the fabric, it's kind of, that's a very interesting question you asked, because actually the fabric was not primarily woven or dyed in Tibet. The fabric in Tibet, they have wool fabric and mostly wool that the weaving that's done there. Most of the silk fabric that was used for these thangkas was given or traded with China and some with Russia at different times in history. And often it was part of their cultural, religious, political interaction between the different countries, their interrelationship. So there would be gifts of tribute in exchange for spiritual teachings, for example. And so there were storehouses of these precious fabrics that had been given or traded, and then they were used to make the thangkas. So I do not know. I wish I knew, but I don't know about the dyeing, how it was done.
Well, that's great. The information you gave me was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for an interesting question. Well, thank you, everybody. I think, did you have something else, Raina?
Oh, no. I think, well, I think all in all, it's just such a, thangkas themselves, in and of themselves, are such a meticulous art form. But I think do you feel, I'm sure you've been in contact with some other, let's say, painters of thangkas over the years. Have you ever sort of conversed with them about, the differences between, we're all working towards the same goal, right? Like Buddha Dharma, the creation of wonderful Buddhist art. But, is there any conversation just out of, comparing the differences or similarities?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think they're very individual, but it was interesting that just recently, Pema Namdo Taye, who's a wonderful, multi-talented Tibetan artist and architect. He does three-dimensional mandalas and structures, and also is a painter and a sculptor. And he, in his comment, he actually wrote a preface to the book, and he, in his comments, said he said applique is harder than painting. And I don't know what he meant, because I think it really just depends on your, just, what you're naturally drawn to, and then what you've been trained in. But I do think, there are those differences, like I said, about the level of detail. So the work is meticulous in both, but visually there's smaller details in some thangka paintings, not all. There's some paintings that are quite simple and open, but there can be these very, very detailed. Sometimes you'll see ones with, hundreds of figures, and whereas the applique is kind of bolder and bigger. And actually, this was actually really important in getting drawings done, because normally the applique artists rely on thangka painters to produce the drawings, but not all thangka painters know how to produce a drawing that will work for applique. So I had some challenges with that at the beginning when I asked some of my thangka painter friends whose paintings I admired so much to create drawings for me. Some of them just didn't come together. They just, because the applique work, you have to have pieces that can be outlined, right? Whereas with painting, you could just leave something open and gradually fade off. And also, like I said, the details have to be a little bit more spacious. So that was an interesting thing in noticing that some of the painters learn and appreciate the differences and what's required, and many don't, because they just don't have the experience.
Well, thank you so much, Leslie. I think perhaps that wraps up our evening for tonight. And I may first, really thank Leslie for taking the time out of her evening to show us her art and her upcoming book, which I really hope everyone will, check out and have a good read. It's really a fantastic book. And so with that said, I'd like to thank everyone here for joining us for this conversation with Leslie, and I wish you a very good evening and a wonderful week ahead. Thank you so much for joining us, and hope you've also visited our website at BDG soon, and also and order Leslie's book as well. Do both.
Thank you, Raymond, and thank you everyone so much for coming. It was really a pleasure.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.